Вие сте с гласът на Капитал. Подкастът, в който журналистите от Капитал разказват големите теми от седмицата в дълбочина, с контекст и анализ. В него ви срещаме и с хора от сферата на политиката и бизнеса, с които говорим за важните въпроси днес.
Здравейте! Вие сте с гласът на Капитал, а аз съм Зорница Стоилова. Намираме ли се на прага на това да отключим тайната на дълголетието? Идеята да живеем вечно занимава човечеството откакто свят светува. От митовете, търсещи фонтана на младостта, до съвременните пробиви в генетиката и биохакинга. В този епизод ще потърсим сечението между науката и комерциалните, но често преувеличени обещания за дълъг живот. Как амбицията да добавим години към живота си и да подобрим качеството им ще трансформира различни пазарни ниши, работната сила и дори самото ни разбиране за стареенето, това ще обсъдим с британския футурист Дейвид Ууд. С дългогодишен опит в технологичната индустрия и магистърска степен по математика от Кеймбридж, Дейвид Ууд е изпълнителен директор на Фондация ЛЕВ. Тя се занимава с научни изследвания за предотвратяването на заболявания, свързани с стареенето. Освен това, Ууд е автор на редица книги за бъдещето, включително и за дълголетието, и е един от водещите на подкаста London Futurists. Той ще бъде специален гост на Longevity форума, организиран от Капитал на 10 април. Това е събитие, което ще събере експерти в областта на медицината, генетиката, икономиката и технологиите, и те ще обсъдят как да живеем по-дълго в по-добро здраве. Повече за Longevity форума и как да се регистрирате, вижте в описанието под този епизод. And now, without further ado, let me welcome Mr. Ууд to the Voice of Capital. Thank you for joining us today.
It's my pleasure to be here. I'm looking forward to visiting Sofia soon and to having lots of great discussions about the future of healthy longevity.
So, in your book that you wrote on longevity, you frame longevity as the abolition of aging, a wording that in my mind, I associate with something like, let's say, the abolition of slavery. Is it on purpose that you chose this particular term to describe getting rid of aging?
You've got it right. Yes, slavery is similar to aging in that for most of history, most people said, it's not very nice, but what can we do? You need slaves to have a good society. You need aging for various hypothetical philosophical reasons. Most of the ancient holy books, they don't say slavery is bad. There's no commandment in the 10 commandments to say thou shalt not keep slaves. The only reference to slaves in the 10 commandments is when we are instructed, don't envy your neighbor's slave. Just after the bit that says don't envy your neighbor's wife, and before the bit that says don't envy your neighbor's ox or ass. And there are many detailed laws in the Old Testament about slaves are some kind of second-class citizens. You can treat them fairly badly because they're your property, but they still have some rights. So that was most of history. And people thought about it, well, it's not very nice to be a slave, but it's essential for the well-being of society. Until more and more people said, hang on, there should be a better way. And in various countries, I'm familiar with what happened in America and in Britain, but in other countries too, there was a groundswell of moral outrage. We should find better ways to structure society. And thank goodness, slavery in stages was abolished. It'll be the same with aging. People say, well, you need aging because if there's no death, then somehow life has no purpose. A bit like saying if marriages don't end in divorce, then the marriage is without purpose. On the contrary, I will say that the purpose of life is life. The purpose of marriage is marriage, not the end of the marriage or the end of life. But people still have these arguments and contortions. We might talk about some, but it's my view that people will wake up to the possibility of a better way of living, a way in which people no longer need to age. It'll be an option. It won't be compulsory. If people really do want to become frail and incontinent and weak, that's their choice. But I don't think many people will actually make that choice when they see the possibilities that modern medicine is going to put in our grasp.
Well, what would you say to those skeptics who argue that aging is just a part of life, it's normal, it's inevitable, it's not only related to weakness or sickness, but also with getting more wise, let's say?
So getting wise is fine. We can have that part of aging, which is fine. So I'm not against aging in that sense. You know, a wine that is aged is better often than a wine that is young. That's fine. What I'm against is the frailty, the decline, the growing likelihood of dying, which is what aging actually means. Now, it's true that's part of nature, but there are many other things that are natural that we humans have decided to fight against. The state of nature for most of history is that most women would die fairly young and would have many of their children predecease them. There would be deaths of multiple children in childhood, even in the kings and queens of the great lands in Europe. Many times they had most of their children dying in youth. That was the state of nature. And thankfully, people said, we can do better. And we developed notions of hygiene, we developed vaccinations, we developed better nutrition, and all kinds of other things like antibiotics. And as a result, many fewer people suffer what used to be natural, which is an early death.
Well, if we think philosophically, what do you think is possible in your view? Maybe not in our lifetime, but in general. Do you think eternal life is possible, or just extending the human lifespan by, like, let's say, many years?
So eternity is another concept altogether. What I have in mind is the concept that people won't age. In other words, that people will be as healthy in their 60s, 70s, and 80s as they were in their 20s, 30s, and 40s. And going forward, if they're still living in their 120s or 140s, again, they will be as healthy as in their 20s or 40s. Some philosophers have defined another term for this, not immortality, but amortality, that there isn't a growth in the mortality with more aging. Now, I don't think we need to wait for hundreds of years for this to come around. I think there is the prospect that by the 2040s, treatments of making this possible for everybody might be with us. It's not a certainty. It's probably about 30 to 50% chance we will have such treatments by that time. But if we decide as a society to prioritize that outcome, in the same way that earlier societies decided to prioritize the abolition of slavery, things could change much more quickly than is commonly assumed.
If we talk about now, what are, in your view, the most promising current, like, scientific research? And are we close to any breakthrough in your view?
There's a lot of very exciting and very interesting scientific research taking place. One strand is looking at animals that don't age. Now, we're familiar that most of the animals we love, like our pet dogs, our horses, our pet birds, and of course, humans, we do age, which means that the longer we live, we become more likely to die. For humans, there's a law, it's called the Gompertz law. It's 200 years old. It was discovered first by an actuarial researcher, Benjamin Gompertz, in London in 1825, 200 years ago, that every 8 years that someone lives after the age of 35, they are twice as likely to die. You can compound that up. Every 25 years that somebody lives, they are 10 times as likely to die as before. But not all animals follow that Gompertz curve, and there are a fascinating number of animal superagers. One of them is the so-called naked mole rat, which is a species of small rodent that lives in underground burrows. It's got a fascinating lifestyle. They're nearly blind, but they live without aging. In other words, if you take one of these creatures in its 20s or 30s, it's no more likely to die than when it was younger. And there are some in the lab that have now lived more than 40 years, which is astonishing for a creature that small. And all the nasty things that researchers know that normally would give rodents cancer, when you apply it to these creatures, that shrugs them off. There is no cancer in almost every case. And if you try to give them osteoarthritis, there are things, again, that nasty scientists know how to give animals osteoarthritis, and again, these animals shrug them off. And I mentioned the naked mole rats in some detail, but there's dozens of similar animals, including fish, including birds, including insects, including more simple sea life, which in various ways have this property. So what are we doing? We're studying hard to figure out what are their secrets. The point is, there's nothing built into biology that dictates that aging happens. On the contrary, there are multiple mechanisms, it seems, whereby nature has provided the ability, in some cases, for animals not to age. So that's being researched as a high priority.
It's part of the research that you're doing also in your foundation, this mouse rejuvenation project. Can you share, like, what have you found out looking at these animals and how they age? Is there something that can apply also to human beings as a conclusion?
That's a great question. So in the LEV Foundation, that's the Longevity Escape Velocity Foundation, the unique research that we're doing is combining multiple treatments. And we're doing this in mice because mice live quite short amount of time. If you do an experiment on a human, you might have to wait decades to find out, did it really work or not in terms of extending lifespan? Whereas with a mouse that typically lives 2.5 years, what we do, we take mice that are already middle-aged, that is 18 months, which is similar to a human being, perhaps who's 50 years old. They've never had any special treatment. There's no genetic modifications. They are standard laboratory mice at the age of 18 months. And scientists already know a number of treatments that can extend the average remaining lifespan of such mice from the default of 1 year, which would be similar to humans living from 50 to 80. They can extend it by up to 4 months. Now, what we want to do is find out which combinations of these treatments can have a cumulative effect. And our goal is that instead of the mice living at most 4 more months rather than 12, it would be 16, our goal is that they will double their remaining lifespan as a result of receiving this combination of treatments. Now, the treatments we apply are those that have already been found by other researchers. We're not coming up with brand new treatments of our own. What is unique, however, is combining them together. We've done one complete run of this experiment. It started in early 2023. We have 1,000 middle-aged mice. That sounds a lot, but you need quite a lot for the numbers to be statistically significant. We gave them combinations of up to 4 different anti-aging treatments. We have an equal number of male mice and female mice. We have lots of controls, which is why you end up with needing such a large number of mice. And we found basically that there is some small additive consequences of the treatments we applied, but nothing yet that will take us beyond that 4-month period. But in the 2 years that have passed, there's been lots more scientific findings. So in the second phase of this project, we call it robust mouse rejuvenation. That's RMR. We're going to apply up to 8 treatments in parallel. And the reason we need, we think, multiple treatments is aging is not just one kind of damage, which has one kind of cure. Aging likely consists of multiple types of cellular and extracellular damage. So it's quite likely that we'll need to apply multiple types of damage repair interventions in parallel. So we're about to start the second phase of this experiment with probably another 1,000 mice, maybe even 2,000 mice if we're going to do these 8 treatments. It depends upon receiving sufficient funding, and we're in the process now of obtaining that funds from various bodies.
So can you give us an example of what kind of treatments have you applied to those mice?
Well, the first is a quite well-known drug called rapamycin. Rapamycin was discovered in Easter Island, which is called by the natives there Rapa Nui, so hence rapamycin. It has a long and fascinating history, which I won't go into, but it was discovered by accident that when people are given rapamycin, they seem to live longer than expected. So what is the cause of this? It seems that it pushes people into a repair mode, which is similar to when you are fasting or when you're doing intermittent fasting. It's been known for nearly 100 years, in fact, that if you restrict the amount of calories that various small animals get, including fish or mice, it tends to make them live longer. And the mechanisms for this are increasingly understood. And the point of rapamycin is it has the same effect without starving the mice. So that's good. So that's one of the four. A second one was, it's a bit complicated, but I'll explain. In our DNA, which is where all our genes are, when a cell divides, all the chromosomes get copied, but there's a bit at the very end of the chromosome, it's known as a telomere, which doesn't completely get copied. So sometimes people describe it as a bit like a shoelace. There's an end of the shoelace to prevent the shoelace fraying. But every time the cells divide, that telomere gets a little bit shorter, with the result that eventually it's no longer able to divide, and the cell is no longer viable to do anything apart from remain there. And so one of the theories of aging is that it's due to the shortening of telomeres. Now, nature has provided an enzyme. It's called telomerase, and telomerase can make the telomeres longer again. And the question is, well, why isn't it used more widely? And scientists think that if there were too much telomerase, it might lead to cells dividing too much. It might lead to too much cancer. So there's a complicated balancing act here. But the view is that we can do a little bit better than the balance that nature has struck. Evolution has done wonderful things, but it's by no means perfect. And so the second treatment we have is to apply some telomerase enzyme into these mice, which will extend the length of their telomeres. A third treatment was to do with giving them younger blood or aspects of younger blood. A famous experiment in mice has been that if you surgically connect two mice, now that's not what we did, but this is the background. If you connect a young mouse and an old mouse so that their blood is shared, then remarkably, afterwards, when you study the old mouse, you'll find that its organs have typically been rejuvenated, that its brain is more like the brain of a young mouse, its heart is more like the heart of a young mouse. Sadly, it's the other way around. The old mouse gets a bit aged. And people argue a lot, well, what's actually the effect here? Is it due to something from the young mouse going into the old mouse? Or is it that the old mouse is having its old blood somehow diluted and some of the bad things that accumulate in the old blood are no longer as effective? So instead of that, what we did was we transplanted some blood substance from young mice into these middle-aged mice. And just to round this off, the fourth thing that we did is yet again a very different idea. It's something called senolytics. Senolytics refers to the concept of senescent cells. Senescent cell is one that is basically saying to the immune system, I've gone wrong, I need to be cleaned up, please tidy me up. But the immune system is no longer able to repair it. And so it remains there. Sometimes people call them zombie cells. They're dead, but they are still living in a sense. And as we get older, more of our bodies have more of these senescent cells all over. It's the source of many diseases, like in the lungs or in the kidneys or in parts of the skin, when the body is no longer able to remove the senescent cells. Well, senolytics is a mechanism to trigger the body's own repair mechanisms. So that was the fourth of the treatments we applied in the mice in RMR1.
Listening to you explain the complexities of the science behind aging, I'm thinking, are we close to something like a scientific consensus that we can actually stop aging or reverse it? Or what's the, let's say, the controversies in the scientific community?
There's a lot of discussion. It's a vibrant field, and just as in other vibrant scientific fields, there are different theories. The main difference is which treatments should be prioritized. Some people say there are treatments that if we did them, you might get the benefits of all the other ones for free too. So the most famous one more recently, which only became viable for mice after we started RMR1, so it wasn't included there, but we are going to include it in the second round, is something called epigenetic reprogramming. Now, epigenetic refers to something of on the skin of the genome. It's not the genome itself, but it's all the other chemicals that attach as a kind of covering or wrapping to the genes. And what are these chemicals doing there? It's distinguishing the nature of the DNA in different cells, because actually we've got the same DNA in almost all the cells of our body. But the skin cells create proteins for the skin, the heart cells create proteins suitable for the heart, brain cells create proteins suitable for the brain. And this is done by epigenetic tags. So that's how nature works, with epigenetic tags that make some of the DNA visible in each cell and cover up the rest of it. Now, as we age, guess what? These tags get misplaced. We have more of the tags coming in. It's a relatively constant rate. It's one of the most interesting findings in the last 20 years in the science of aging. But even more interesting is there are mechanisms to undo some of that accumulation of epigenetic aging. There was a Nobel Prize awarded for this in, I think, 2012 to a Japanese researcher, Shinya Yamanaka, who found a combination of proteins. They're called transcription factors. There were 4 of them that if you applied them to cells, they would have the ability to restate, to push that cell back into a younger stage. So it's quite complicated. Again, there are complications that if you do too much of it, you might encourage the growth of cancers. So there's a balance to be struck, but we think we can do better than what nature has done, which is applying this. And people who have done some preliminary experiments are excited because they say, well, when you fix this bit of damage, lots of other kinds of damage seem to be fixed too. So I call these theories singular theories of aging, that there might be a single thing which will have a lot of consequences. And by the way, there are singular theories of telomerase too. What I mentioned earlier, there are a number of scientists who believe that if this were done, it would make the cells so healthy that it would undo all the other damage. Now, I don't actually think that's likely to be correct myself. There are arguments you can go into as to if it was just a single cause, nature would have found a way to provide that. I think instead we're going to have to do multiple things, but I'm open to experiments. I'm open to what science does best, which is you come up with a theory and you apply it in an experiment and you see whether your hypothesis is refuted or whether it still stands up.
And you mentioned prioritizing a couple of times. Do you think we are funding anti-aging research enough currently, like in terms of governments, universities, pharmaceutical companies? And what would be the economic benefits if we invest harder in anti-aging research?
Well, let's do the economic benefits first. We do spend a lot of money on people who are aged, and it's when they've got diseases at the end of their life. Typically, we use more of our national health budget in the last few years of our life than in all the earlier years put together. We're in and out of hospital so many times, and it's difficult to treat us at that stage because there are multiple things wrong with us. And we all can think of relatives, elderly relatives in our families who are in that sad situation. So we're already spending a lot of money on the aged. Far better it would be, there's an English proverb, a stitch in time saves 9. If you could prevent that damage from accumulating, you wouldn't have to spend all that money in actually dealing with the consequences of aging. Instead, you would spend less money in providing treatments. And here's another example. Most of us visit the dentist once or maybe twice a year to have our teeth expertly cleaned. Why? It's because when our teeth are expertly cleaned, it removes the accumulation of plaque and other junk, and that makes it less likely we're going to get serious gum disease. And by the way, if we have gum disease, it's likely to increase the chance that we'll get brain disease later in life. So we already do this kind of detox on a regular basis. It's one of the most successful types of preventative medicine. Well, what we theorists in anti-aging have in mind is there will be similar treatments. And we spend some money every time we go to the dental hygienist, but nothing much and nothing like as much as it would cost if we had to treat full-blown gum disease or, even worse, full-blown brain disease. So that's the economic argument. It's summarized in the phrase, the longevity dividend, which is similar to the phrase that used to be common, the peace dividend. You know, if you establish peace, you won't have to spend so much money on swords and armaments. You can spend more money on plowshares, to use that biblical phrase, and on other positive aspects like education. Well, if we spend money sensibly on prevention, which is these damage repair treatments, we won't need to worry about having to spend so much money on aged. So back to the first part of your question. Are we doing enough? Absolutely not. It's pathetic. It's something like 1% of 1% of what we could be spending, we are. There is some money allocated for research into aging, but if you look in most countries, what they mean is the joke is sometimes the NIA in America, the National Institute of Aging, is actually the National Institute for Alzheimer's. Most of their money goes in looking at treatments for Alzheimer's, which is a good thing. I don't object to money being spent on Alzheimer's. The problem is they're trying to treat it as a disease, whereas what I would prefer is we should look at the underlying causes of that disease, which is the damage that accumulates. Damage in the brain, damage in the teeth, perhaps damage in other parts of our body, the decline in health of our mitochondria, which are the energy sources inside our cells, and so forth. So as a society, we spend much, much more money researching new flavors of ice cream. We spend much more money researching new types of vape to addict youngsters on vaping. We spend much more money on encouraging people to click on adverts online and spend time online. It's a complete inversion of any sensible priorities. The humanitarian thing is to take lots of budget away from these other activities and apply it to basic research in aging.
But how do we make sure that if we do get enough research and scientific breakthroughs in this area, that they're available to not just billionaires, as it currently is, but that everybody can benefit from those extension therapies?
So there are two possible scenarios. One is the scenario you've just described, that it's only the wealthy who are going to benefit. But the other scenario is the same that has happened with many other areas of technology and indeed medicine, which is the technology starts off not very good, but still very expensive, but over time it gets increasingly affordable. Now, I was for 25 years in what became the smartphone industry. I was a software engineer when very few people had mobile computers in their pockets. I had a mobile computer in my pocket since 1988 with some mobile apps on it. And to start off with, smartphones were viewed as something that only the rich could afford. But guess what? As time has passed, as there has been economies of scale, as there has been an incredible competitive pressure, companies have found cleverer and cleverer ways to produce excellent smartphones at a fraction, literally a fraction of the original cost. That's not just something for smartphones. The equipment that's in a modern car is astonishing compared to what was in similar cars 30 years ago in terms of all the capabilities it's got. It's the same with flat screen TVs, and it's the same with many aspects of medicine too. If we look at the case of the COVID vaccine, when COVID first started off, people were worried about two things. They said, oh, it always takes us 10 years to develop a vaccine for human use of a coronavirus. Goodness gracious, we're going to have a disaster. And when it's here, it will only be for the billionaires. Well, it wasn't quite said like that. It'll only be for the wealthy countries. Well, when society decided this was an existential crisis, when we applied many more resources to it, as we should with a similar war on aging. In fact, the war on aging should be much more intense than the war on COVID, but we can learn from the war on COVID. First, it brought vaccines out at a fast speed, and second, they were available pretty soon for everyone on the planet, with some minor local exceptions. So that's the vision, that the costs will come down. Now, to help ensure that that scenario triumphs rather than the wealthy only benefiting, which might happen if there are monopoly companies who hold on to their intellectual property and keep the price of medical treatments high, as sadly is the case often in the United States. You know, it's a great country in many ways, but it has abysmally high health charges. And there are many other things wrong with its health services. It has great care, quality of care, if you can afford it, but most people can't. So that's why that first scenario you described has got some credibility. But the way to fix that is with democratic pressure. If more people really stand up and say, you know what, this is for the good of the whole country, that everybody should benefit, that we don't have to spend lots of money on sick people when they're old because they won't get sick, because they won't age, then any sensible political parties will adopt that as part of their manifesto. And the parties that don't adopt it will be voted out of office. And that assumes you've got a healthy democracy, and that's by no means certain. If we look around the world, there are an increasing number of countries that are giving up on elements of democracy. So the scenario you described is possible, but the rest of us should campaign actively, not just for the science, not just for funding to come to the science, but so that these principles of equitable access are truly championed by everyone.
Are there currently countries in the world who are leaders in this field, like in terms of prioritizing anti-aging research or therapies that are already available to their people?
The country I think that is most admirable is Singapore. So Singapore have brought in some of the world's best anti-aging researchers working at the National University of Singapore. And they have given them, in some cases, a contract which specifies that they will be paid more if, in a certain period of time, the average health span of the Singapore person extends. And I can't remember the details. So that's exactly the right kind of outcome. So it's not that they'll be paid more if they have to apply more medical services, which is how most doctors work around the world. You know, if you diagnose more diseases and suggest more treatments, you end up being paid more for it. On the contrary, they are prioritizing avoiding the need for these medical services. So Singapore are leading the way, as actually they often do, because their view is what they need to do as a company, as a country, is they find out the best practice that happens elsewhere in the world, and then they figure out how they can apply that, not without any changes, but adapted as appropriate for their local circumstances. So that's an example that other countries should be following.
And you also mentioned the technological development and how fast it can accelerate our understanding or acceptance of certain concepts. What's the role in AI in all this longevity field, in your view? How can it actually help us accelerate, let's say, biological research?
AI can have a remarkable impact on the speed of biological research. One example is the solution called AlphaFold, which actually was responsible for the Nobel Prize in Chemistry last year. It was given to two people at the AI company DeepMind, along with one of their colleagues who was a professor at, I think, the University of Washington in Seattle. And the three of them were using AI to predict how proteins would fold. Now, a protein is a long molecule made up of a string of amino acids, and you can understand each of the amino acids, but it's harder to understand how that molecule is going to fold up in 3 dimensions. And that's critical because how it interacts with other molecules as part of normal metabolism, or possibly as part of a disease, or possibly as part of a cure for a disease, does depend on knowing in advance how that molecule will fold. And this is an outstanding problem for 60 years when it was first noted. And people had all kinds of different ideas on how to solve it. Well, over the decades, more data was accumulated on how individual proteins folded in 3 dimensions. And the AlphaFold software of the company DeepMind, developed in London in the UK, largely, was able to work out from that training set how other proteins would fold as well. And it did it so reliably that the Nobel Prize was given, and it is being used now in biochemical labs all around the world. Now, the next step from AlphaFold is AlphaProteo, and that does the inverse thing. So instead of working out in advance how a protein will fold and what the shape will be in 3 dimensions, and therefore what its biochemical reactions will be, you say, well, I would like something to fit in here. I would like it to have these biochemical reactions. And it then figures out, well, if we had a protein that was made like this, it would fold up and it would have these properties. So it's solving the inverse problem. And that's only the start of what's likely to come. So AI is likely to accelerate many aspects of the discovery of drugs, the discovery of medical treatments. AI is also likely to speed up a lot of the testing of new treatments because that's often what slows things down. You have to, quite rightly, spend a lot of time testing your product to see if it's safe, and then testing it to see if it truly is effective. In other words, is it more than just statistical chance that people get better after taking this treatment compared to not taking the treatment? And that takes a long time to do these tests. It goes through phase 1, phase 2, and then phase 3. Well, with adequate models, adequate AI models, you can anticipate with a strong degree of confidence what some of the results will be. Another thing that AI can do is it can power robots, literal robots, which can do some of the experiments automatically rather than relying on humans to do the same thing. So that's the start of what AI can do. More generally, AI gives us more intelligence. AI is able to give us individual guidance. And increasingly, scientific researchers, when they've got a problem, they're not just themselves doing a Google search anymore of the scientific literature. They're asking AI assistants to do that research on their behalf. And many times they are astonished by the creativity of the ideas that are coming up. Now, you still have to test the ideas because occasionally these AI models hallucinate. In other words, they make things up. But once you've had a discussion with your AI collaborator, you can then validate it by yourself. And more scientists are reporting that it's like having a team of postdoctoral researchers assisting them, except that the AI doesn't get tired, doesn't get cranky, it doesn't have bad days, it doesn't fight with its colleagues. It's much more of a joy to work with. So again, that's going to accelerate things, which is why I said at the beginning that there is a chance we'll have these rejuvenation treatments available for everybody by the early 2040s.
But as with everything that AI does lately, it's setting a much faster pace that we can actually understand, accept, realize. And so I'm thinking, just as with the technological pace, the understanding of aging, how can we get closer to this idea that maybe we can stop aging, maybe we can reverse it, like in terms of broader societal acceptance?
Well, I think people generally have two minds about aging. When we are young, we don't have a conception of death. And then suddenly we realize, oh, my elder relatives, my grandparents are going old and they're going to die. Oh, some of them have died. Oh, it's terrible. Oh, maybe I'm going to get old and die. Oh, that's so horrible. And for a while, most of us are in this stage of outrage. But then, guided by elder members of our family, our parents, we are told, well, look, it's not too bad, really. Get used to it. You might, if you're lucky, end up in heaven with the angels. You might see your granny again there. Or more broadly, it's just part of nature. You can live on through your descendants. You can live on through your work, through your heritage. And so there are these two minds. The original mind that is shocked and horrified by the idea of aging, and then what sometimes people call the wise approach, where wise is very definitely in inverted commas, says the most important thing to do in life is to learn to accept what we cannot change. And there's a very famous prayer popularized by the theologian Reinhold Niebuhr. It says, God, give me the grace to accept the things I cannot change. Buddha taught basically the same, that we have to stop struggling against suffering. We have to, and that is the nature of suffering. It's our struggle. Instead, we have to become calm. And Buddhists sometimes say you have to study corpses of dead animals and dead people and accept it. But, and there's a very big but here, the prayer popularized by Reinhold Niebuhr goes on, give me the grace to accept what I cannot change. Give me the courage to change what I can, and give me the wisdom to know the difference. In other words, if we really can change something, we should not sit back passive. So when it was the time to abolish slavery, it was the right thing to speak up and become involved. And when it was the time sometimes to throw out a government, when it was the time to demonstrate for some things, when it was the time to work hard and make an important breakthrough in technology, it was right to do that. And the key thing is that final clause, the wisdom to know the difference. So most people still think, I shouldn't get my hopes up about solving aging because it's likely to be naive. It's likely to be foolish. What chance is it that it's going to happen at this time when I'm alive, when as all the other great people throughout history had to suffer aging? It seems implausible. I don't want to get my hopes up. They're going to be dashed. Therefore, I'm going to not allow myself to believe this. I'm going to push off these ideas. And this is what people sometimes call the pro-aging trance. There was a book called The Denial of Death by the writer Ernst Becker. Very deep book in my view. Becker's thesis is that much of human society is driven by not facing up to aging and other things to try and have a different kind of immortality. So literature, poetry, many of great institutions are about finding a different kinds of immortality. So Becker said civilization is driven by subconscious thinking about aging, just as Freud said civilization is driven by subconscious thinking about sex, and Marx said that civilization is driven by class struggle. All three have a point, and the point now is to free people from this denial of death, to allow people to see the scientific evidence that some animals don't age, some humans age much better than others. There are human super ages, and here are experiments which are extending the lives of various animals. And here's the theoretical understanding of why it should be possible fairly soon to have this. And as more people grasp this, first of all, more scientists are willing to steer their career into this direction. In the 1980s, there was only literally a couple of handfuls of scientists who were brave enough to say they were working on the solution of aging. By the 1990s, there were roughly 10 times as many, and they were inspired by seeing some of the interesting results from the first group. For example, at the late 1980s, there was an experiment that doubled the lifespan of a worm, a C. elegans worm, by a particular genetic modification. There were also experiments done by Michael Rose, which extended the lives of fruit flies by various mechanisms. So people could see this seems to be possible, although most scientists were told by the supervisors, don't get into this field, it's a dead end for your career. But gradually more people got involved. And then in the 2000s, there were the first proper anti-aging conferences in Cambridge and elsewhere. In the 2010s, again, the field has grown about tenfold. And why? Because more people see the positive examples of others, and they're prepared to stand up in defiance of society's pro-aging trance and do what's necessary. So there's an exponential increase in the number of scientists active. That number of scientists is already made more effective by AI assistance, and it's going to be made more effective again, depending on how well we are able to collaborate. And AI is going to help us probably collaborate even better. So more members of society need to see this. And to help them see it, we have to be patient to address all the questions they've got in their minds, such as the one you asked me earlier. Won't it just be for the rich? Another typical question is, well, won't the earth become overpopulated? Another typical question is, won't life lose its meaning if we die? And so on it goes. And there are good answers for all of these. But you know what? Even when people are given the good answers, typically they still cling on to some illusion that death is somehow good, because they're not willing to face up to the change in their whole ideology, their thinking, their paradigm, if you like, which is quite a difficult thing to budge. So it will take a while. And gradually people will be influenced, not just by what people like me say, but when their friends say it too. And so the role of influencers, YouTube influencers, media influencers, when people that are well admired by the general public start saying, you know what, anti-aging is within our grasp and they personally would like it, it's going to help tip more members of the general public over into supporting this too. And when members of the general public demand a war on aging, politicians will act.
Listening to you, I'm thinking about how this growing trend of healthy living, healthy lifestyle maybe helped people reach to the conclusion that it's not just about their DNA, but how they age also depends on how they live their life, their daily habits and everything. But there's also the kind of people that say, well, where's the joy of life if I have to monitor my every move, like how much I sleep, what is it that I eat, did I take enough vitamins today, am I moving enough? It's getting too much sometimes. And how would you talk to these people?
So we have to make the monitoring unintrusive. We have to make the monitoring automatic. And many of the modern equipments, whether it's rings that you can wear on your finger or other patches, increasing number of people wear continuous glucose monitors to give them an alert if their glucose is spiking upwards, if they're diabetic or pre-diabetic. And these things are marvelous because you don't need to be conscious of them most of the time, that if you are moving into a danger zone, it gives you a prompt warning. So I think people will find ways that this treatment happens relatively easily. To go back to the analogy of going to the dentist, it is a bit of an inconvenience to take time out of our day to visit the dental hygienist, but on the grand scale of things, it's not too bad. It's a bit of an inconvenience to go to the gym, but you know what? We can make it pleasant. When we go to the gym, or in my case, I may walk. I will walk with my headset on. I'll be listening to a book. So it's a real pleasure. I might think, well, it's an inconvenience to have to walk for an hour and a half a day to get my 10,000 steps in. But, you can reframe it in a way that it's not just making you healthier, it is also benefits elsewhere in your life. So we will figure out ways to do this so that it's not a huge inconvenience. And in the end, if it really is a choice between doing these things and having longer lifespan and not doing them and dying sooner and in a miserable way, I think most people will choose to take some time out of their current life in order to prioritize a healthier choice.
What happens to our poor Earth if we start live longer and continue destroying it?
The fascinating thing is that even nearly 2,000 years ago, there were some writers who already thought there were too many humans on the Earth. We were in some of the cities generating far too much waste and rubbish, and it was a terrible place to live. Well, guess what? We are able to use technology to be much more efficient. First of all, in how we grow food, and secondly, how we reprocess and recycle our waste. Another example is that in the 1970s, the writer Paul Ehrlich wrote a book called The Population Bomb, and he was certain that in the coming decade, hundreds of millions of people in India and elsewhere would starve to death. There is no way, he said, that India could possibly look after its present population. Well, since then, the population of India has more than quadrupled, and there is still some poverty and malnourishment in India. I don't deny it, but they are much better at growing food. This was partly the Green Revolution, which was kicking off at the time Paul Ehrlich was writing, and he didn't properly take account of it in his book. Now, in the end, there will be limits on what we can do with the earth. In the end, we will only be able to look after a certain number of people on the earth, but that number is far more than at present. And the biggest single change is that most people don't realize how much of the earth is given over to growing crops, to feed to animals, which we subsequently slaughter, and we eat their meat. Now, this is a terribly inefficient way of growing meat to eat. And there's a much better way of growing meat to eat. It's called lab-grown meat or cellular meat or cultivated meat. People have different names for it, in which it's a bit like brewing whiskey, brewing beer. You can actually do it entirely in a laboratory, and it requires much less water. It has many fewer carbon gas emissions. It's more healthy because we don't have to give these animals antibiotics in such large scale because we are much more in control of the environment. It's much less suffering to the animals involved, and it uses a fraction of the space of land. So if we convert to this, and the same technologies, by the way, the same improvements in biochemistry that will allow us to live longer, similar ones will make this lab-grown meat inexpensive and high quality and utterly delicious. So that's a big change ahead, but it will give us much more land back to grow more places where humans can live. We can grow environmentally friendly skyscrapers. In the end, we can go into space, but we don't particularly have to hurry there. Maybe in 100 years' time, we will have more people living in space than on Earth. But in the foreseeable future, there's plenty of space on the Earth for arguably 10 times the current population.
And finally, David, I'm curious, how did you personally get involved into this topic? What fascinated you about longevity studies?
Well, when I was a child, I went through the same process that I described earlier. I was horrified at the possibility of aging and death, and I resolved, if possible, to do something about it. But I didn't see much that could be done. I just hoped that eventually, maybe, there would be some scientific breakthroughs. Then in my professional career, I saw the improvements that were possible with mobile computing and smartphones. I saw how quickly the devices became much more capable. There was this trajectory known as Moore's Law, which every 18 months, the power of semiconductors doubles roughly for the same cost. And as a result, there's much more memory, there's much more computational power, there's much more information that can be shared. So in a similar way, if only it was possible to edit the human biology and have the similar progress, well, then I discovered the writings of people such as Ray Kurzweil and Aubrey de Grey, who in various ways also predicted that there are treatments increasingly going to become available. So I first encountered Aubrey de Grey a bit more than 20 years ago, when he was much less famous than he is now. He is probably the world's best-known advocate of taking strong measures to abolish aging as quickly as possible. At first, I wasn't sure whether I could trust his views. At university, I studied mathematics, but then the philosophy of science, 4 years of each, at Cambridge. And what philosophy of science teaches, amongst other things, is how to distinguish pseudoscience from real science, or as we might call it nowadays, fake science from real science. And fake science looks like science. It uses scientific words, it's got scientific formulas, it's got people wearing lab coats, but actually it's not real science. So I needed some time to figure out if what people like Ray Kurzweil and particularly Aubrey de Grey were saying, if it was pseudoscience or real science. And eventually I wrote a book, The Abolition of Aging, about 10 years later, to figure that out for sure. And my conclusion is, yes, this is a very strong scientific research methodology. It doesn't know all the answers, but that's what science research methodologies are about. It's a very encouraging paradigm, to use a word from the philosophy of science, which is a general approach to a scientific problem. So that convinced me that it was real. It also convinced me that I can make a difference to making it happen sooner rather than later, using my capabilities. And for the last 2.5 years, I've actually been working much more closely with Aubrey de Grey. I accepted a role as the executive director of the foundation, of which he is the president and chief science officer. It doesn't mean I stop thinking. On the contrary, we're only going to solve these problems if we keep an open mind, if we're ready for our pet hypothesis to be refuted. If we are unscientific about it and say, oh, no, I already know, I'm not going to look elsewhere, that's not going to serve as well. So it's part of my role to ensure, as Aubrey also does, that we apply the best principles of science here rather than any dogmas. It's via science that we can get more quickly to a comprehensively good solution for everyone.
Thank you so much for this conversation, and I'm looking forward to hearing you speak in Sofia next week, in 2 weeks' time.
I'm looking forward to it too. Thanks for the great questions.
За още любопитни истории в дълбочина, абонирайте се за Капитал. Може да последвате гласа на Капитал във всички аудиоплатформи и да гледате епизодите в YouTube и в A1 Explore TV. Ако имате идеи или искате да ни дадете обратна връзка, пишете ни на писма @kapital.bg или в социалните мрежи. По записа и монтажа на този епизод работи Павлин Даскалов. Продуцент е Ювия Изет, а музиката на гласа на Капитал е композирана от Петър Бундаков.